You know what truly terrifies a narcissist? Not your anger, not your silence, not even your absence. What terrifies them is when you finally understand them. Because the second you do, their entire system of control collapses. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why. Narcissists operate like a faulty algorithm. Simple input, predictable output. They rely on three things: your attention, your confusion, and your emotional reaction. Remove even one, and the whole machine breaks. For years, they program you to believe the chaos is your fault, that their moods are your responsibility, that their approval is the fuel you need to function. But here's the truth they can't handle: they never had power. You were just giving it to them. When you finally step back and observe their patterns like an engineer analyzing a glitch, you see it. The emotional manipulation, the manufactured crises, the constant rewriting of reality. And suddenly, it's not magic anymore. It's just code, bad code. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop defending, the narcissist loses access to their power source. Because people like this don't want love, they want control. And the moment you understand that, they can't operate the way they used to. Narcissists depend on control, not connection, because genuine connection requires vulnerability, reciprocity, and emotional accountability. Three things they find deeply unsafe. To them, relationships are not spaces for mutual growth. They are systems to manage. Their entire sense of identity is externally constructed, built on how others react to them, admire them, or fear disappointing them. Control becomes the mechanism through which they protect that fragile identity. Connection would require them to show authenticity, but authenticity threatens the carefully crafted image they rely on to feel significant. So instead of relating to people, they monitor them, shape them, and subtly engineer interactions that keep them in the dominant position. A narcissist's internal world runs on a simple but rigid logic. If they are not controlling the narrative, they risk being exposed. They fear exposure not in the sense of being caught doing something wrong, but in the sense that someone might see their emotional emptiness, their insecurity, or the dependence they try so hard to hide. Control gives them the illusion that they are invulnerable. This is why they manipulate conversations to center themselves, why they interrupt, why they deflect responsibility, why they shift blame so quickly. If they allow a moment where they are not steering the emotional tone, they might lose the psychological upper hand. Control is also how they regulate their self-worth. Their ego needs constant reinforcement, but they can't tolerate the uncertainty of natural human interaction. Normal relationships ebb and flow. Attention rises and falls. Disagreements happen. Emotions vary. A narcissist interprets this natural rhythm as instability and danger. To compensate, they create dynamics where they determine when affection is given, when it is withdrawn, when conflict begins, and when peace returns. This isn't accidental. It trains the other person to chase approval, to anticipate moods, to apologize even when they aren't wrong. The narcissist becomes the emotional center of gravity, ensuring all energy flows back to them. Because connection is mutual, it requires allowing another person to influence you. But a narcissist cannot tolerate being influenced. It feels like losing control. They must dictate the pace, the direction, and the emotional climate of the relationship. Even positive acts, compliments, gifts, affection often serve the same function: to reinforce dependency or to reset control after a moment where their dominance slipped. They aren't connecting, they're recalibrating the system. This is why someone who starts seeing through the pattern creates such a strong reaction in them. When the other person stops being emotionally reactive, it dismantles the narcissist's main method of maintaining control. When their manipulation techniques no longer shift your emotions, they no longer feel powerful. And because they never built a true connection in the first place, they have nothing real to fall back on. Control was the relationship's foundation, and without it, the entire structure becomes unstable. Narcissists need your confusion for their power to work because confusion is the psychological fog that keeps you emotionally disoriented, less confident in your own perceptions, and more dependent on theirs. When you are unsure of what is real, what is your fault, or what their intentions are, you automatically lean toward their version of events. This gives them the ability to control not only how you see them, but how you see yourself. Confusion isn't an accidental byproduct of their behavior. It is one of their most effective tools. They create an environment where clarity is rare, where their reactions are unpredictable, and where the emotional rules keep changing so you stay focused on understanding them rather than understanding the relationship. Confusion works because it destabilizes your sense of emotional safety. When someone loves you in one moment and criticizes you in the next, when they praise you privately but undermine you publicly, when they deny things you clearly remember, your mind begins searching for stability. Instead of questioning them, you start questioning yourself. That self-doubt becomes the opening they use to establish control. The more you doubt your feelings, the more you depend on their explanations. This dependency is exactly what they want because it keeps you from noticing the imbalance and prevents you from challenging their behavior. They also create confusion by making their responses inconsistent. One day they are affectionate, warm, and available. The next day they are distant, cold, or irritated for no obvious reason. This inconsistency trains your nervous system to stay hyper-attuned to their moods, scanning constantly for what version of them you will get. That mental scanning drains your emotional energy and keeps you locked into their emotional orbit. You stop thinking about what you need and start thinking about how to prevent conflict, how to win back their approval, or how to decode what you did wrong. The more unpredictable they are, the more predictable your reactions become. Confusion also helps them avoid responsibility. When you confront them about something hurtful, they twist the conversation until you're defending your tone, your memory, or your intention instead of discussing what they did. Confusion becomes a shield. If you don't know for sure what happened, you can't hold them accountable. And if they can keep you uncertain long enough, you eventually give up trying. This surrender gives them even more space to operate without consequences. On a deeper level, they rely on confusion because they know that clarity empowers you. The moment you clearly see the pattern, how they manipulate, how they distort, how they create chaos, you become harder to control. Clarity reconnects you with your intuition, your boundaries, and your emotional self-respect. Confusion disconnects you from these things. As long as you are lost in the fog, they remain the one who decides what is true, what matters, and what the relationship is supposed to be. A narcissist's identity collapses when you stop feeding their ego because their sense of self isn't internally generated. It is externally constructed. They don't have a stable, grounded identity that can withstand criticism, indifference, boundaries, or emotional distance. Instead, they depend on a continuous stream of validation to maintain the illusion of superiority and significance. When that validation stops, they don't just feel rejected, they feel like they're disappearing. Their ego needs constant reinforcement, and without it, the mask they carefully built begins to crack. People who have a healthy sense of self can tolerate moments where they aren't admired, praised, or noticed. But for a narcissist, these moments feel like a direct threat to their survival. Their personality is structured around maintaining an image: smart, powerful, attractive, desired, important. Anyone who stops affirming that image becomes dangerous because it forces them to confront the truth they've spent their whole life avoiding. Their self-worth is fragile and dependent on others. When you stop feeding their ego, you strip away the fuel that keeps their false identity functioning. This ego collapse often begins subtly. They may increase their attempts to impress you, charm you, or provoke you. They might exaggerate stories, highlight their accomplishments, or remind you of the ways they believe they are superior. When this fails, they often turn to criticism or hostility. They attack your credibility, your value, or your memories, because if they can't elevate themselves through praise, they try to elevate themselves through dominance. This shift is not random. It's a desperate attempt to regain the emotional control they feel slipping away. The collapse intensifies when the narcissist realizes that none of their usual tactics, guilt, charm, intimidation, or emotional theatrics, are working. At that point, their internal structure becomes unstable. They may experience a type of psychological panic because your indifference exposes the truth they never want acknowledged. They were never in control, you were. You were the one supplying the admiration, the attention, the emotional energy that kept their inflated self-image intact. Without your participation, the entire illusion weakens. This is also why narcissists often try to rewrite history when they sense their ego collapsing. They reshape past events to portray themselves as the victim, the hero, or the misunderstood genius. They need to protect the narrative that keeps them feeling important. When you no longer validate that narrative, they start losing grip on the identity they've crafted. They may cycle rapidly between self-pity and rage, grandiosity and insecurity, because they're desperately searching for someone, anyone, to restore their sense of significance. Ultimately, what collapses isn't just their ego, it's the psychological scaffolding that held their entire personality together. They can't regulate their self-esteem internally, so whenever you stop fueling them, they fall into an emotional freefall. Your emotional independence exposes the truth they can't bear. Without external admiration, they are left alone with themselves, and that is the one reality they cannot tolerate. A narcissist thrives on unpredictability and emotional instability because these conditions give them the perfect environment to maintain control. When emotions are steady, communication is clear, and boundaries are respected, a narcissist has no leverage. Predictability creates accountability, and accountability is something they avoid at all costs. So they manufacture instability, subtly, consistently, and with a precision that often looks accidental but is anything but. They keep you guessing, shifting between warmth and coldness, approval and criticism, attentiveness and detachment. This unpredictability becomes a psychological trap, conditioning you to focus on them, anticipate their moods, and adjust your behavior to avoid conflict. Emotional instability functions as a tool. When someone constantly changes the emotional rules, you lose your sense of footing. One moment, they praise you for a small achievement, making you feel seen and valued. The next moment, they belittle you for something trivial, making you feel like you're falling short. This keeps your nervous system in a constant state of alertness. You start trying to decode their reactions, searching for patterns, hoping that if you do everything right, you'll get the version of them who is kind or affectionate. But they never let you find that pattern because unpredictability is the pattern. They know that as long as you're emotionally off balance, you're more controllable. This instability also helps them distort your reality. When they behave inconsistently, you begin doubting your interpretation of events. If yesterday they said you were the best thing that ever happened to them, and today they claim you're ungrateful or dramatic, the contradiction destabilizes you. You might start believing that their moods reflect your worth, that their reactions are accurate assessments of your behavior. This gives them the upper hand. They become the emotional reference point. Instead of trusting your own perceptions, you rely on theirs. And once they become the authority over how things should feel, they've gained control over your emotional world. At a deeper level, unpredictability protects them from exposure. If they acted consistently, their manipulation would become obvious. Their lies would line up poorly, their tactics would be recognizable, and their motives would be clear. By constantly shifting their behavior, they prevent you from developing a coherent understanding of who they are. They become a moving target psychologically, always rewriting their emotional role and always staying one step ahead of your ability to form clarity. This allows them to maintain an illusion of complexity and depth, when in reality, the inconsistency is simply a shield against vulnerability and accountability. Narcissists are also addicted to the emotional power that instability creates. When you don't know what version of them you'll encounter, you behave cautiously. You smile more, apologize faster, talk softer, or avoid bringing up issues that matter to you. You shrink without realizing it. This shrinking is exactly what they want because it confirms their dominance. The more unpredictable they are, the more predictable your emotional submission becomes. In the end, the instability isn't random, it's engineered. It ensures that your emotional energy revolves around them, your thoughts orbit their behavior, and your sense of peace depends on their mood. Unpredictability becomes the silent architecture of the relationship, designed to keep them powerful and you uncertain. A narcissist's manipulation becomes effective because it attacks one of the most universal human needs, the need to feel seen. Everyone, no matter how strong or independent, wants to feel acknowledged, understood, and valued. Narcissists understand this instinctively, but not in a healthy way. Instead of honoring this human need, they weaponize it. They offer recognition at carefully chosen moments and withdraw it just as strategically. This creates a dynamic where you begin to associate their approval with emotional safety. Ignoring someone, then, is not just a passive act to them. It's a psychological maneuver designed to trigger insecurity and compliance. They know that the absence of recognition can hurt more deeply than direct criticism because it taps into the fear that you don't matter. When a narcissist ignores you, it's rarely because they're busy or disinterested. It's because they are creating a gap you feel compelled to fill. That silence pressures you to chase their attention, prove your worth, or seek reassurance. This is why being ignored by someone you care about feels so painful. It activates an emotional alarm inside you. Narcissists rely on this reaction. They understand that once someone becomes anxious about losing acknowledgement, they become easier to influence. You begin over-explaining, over-apologizing, or over-giving in an attempt to restore harmony. These reactions give the narcissist the control they want without having to ask for it directly. This need for recognition is deeply rooted in human psychology. From childhood, people learn to associate acknowledgement with safety, belonging, and love. Healthy relationships honor this by offering consistent presence and mutual respect. But narcissists exploit it by being selectively present. They show just enough interest to keep you emotionally invested, but not enough to create stability. The unpredictability of their attention keeps you in a loop, relieved when they finally acknowledge you, anxious when they don't, always adjusting yourself to earn more of what they withhold so easily. This cycle gradually conditions you to value their approval more than your own peace. Furthermore, narcissists know that being ignored creates emotional imbalance. The uncertainty forces you to seek clarity, but they never provide it. Instead, they maintain the silence until you break it, giving them the advantage. When you finally reach out, they respond as though nothing happened or suggest you're overreacting. This dismisses your feelings and reinforces the idea that they are the stable one and you are the emotional one. Over time, this erodes your confidence. You begin to doubt your instincts, weakening your boundaries and strengthening their influence. Ultimately, ignoring is a way for narcissists to measure your attachment. Your reaction tells them how deeply you care, how easily you can be triggered, and how much control they have left. The less secure you feel, the more secure they feel. This is why they rely on selective recognition. It keeps you emotionally hungry and them in a position of power. They are not responding to connection, they are responding to control. A narcissist sees your boundaries as a threat to their narrative because boundaries disrupt the story they have built about who they are, who you are, and how the relationship is supposed to function. Their sense of control depends on you being accessible, predictable, and emotionally compliant. Boundaries interrupt that dynamic by introducing limits on your time, your energy, your tolerance, your emotional availability. These limits force the narcissist to face a reality they spend their entire lives avoiding. They don't have full control over other people. A boundary is not just a no, it is a declaration of self-respect, and self-respect from others destabilizes their belief that they are entitled to more than they give. Narcissists maintain a narrative in every relationship. In that narrative, they are the central figure, the wronged hero, the misunderstood genius, the authority, the victim, or the person who deserves special treatment. Your compliance supports this story. When you say yes to things that hurt you, forgive them easily, or tolerate disrespect, you reinforce their belief that their behavior is justified. But when you suddenly say, "This is not acceptable," you contradict the script they've written. To them, this isn't just resistance, it's rebellion. It challenges their worldview, forces accountability, and disrupts the emotional hierarchy they've established. Boundaries also hold up a mirror. When you refuse to allow manipulation, disrespect, or emotional exploitation, you force the narcissist to confront their behavior, even if only for a moment. They cannot tolerate this reflection because it threatens the image they work tirelessly to maintain. Rather than adjusting themselves, they attack the boundary. They may call you selfish, cold, dramatic, or ungrateful. This is not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it exposes the truth. They cannot meet it. Your limit reveals their limitation. A narcissist's biggest fear is losing control of the narrative, and boundaries do exactly that. When you say no, you reclaim the authority over your own life. When you create distance, you reduce their influence. When you stop letting them define your emotions or your worth, their power weakens. They depend on emotional entanglement to maintain dominance, and boundaries untangle you. This threatens the psychological grip they try to hold over you. What makes boundaries so destabilizing is that they strip away the ambiguity narcissists rely on. Without boundaries, they can shift blame, twist conversations, and use emotional inconsistency to keep you off balance. With boundaries, things become clear. Clear rules, clear expectations, clear consequences. Clarity is dangerous to someone who survives through manipulation. It takes away the shadows where their tactics thrive. But the deepest threat boundaries pose is the implication behind them, that you see your own worth. When you protect your peace, your time, and your heart, you communicate that you are not dependent on their approval. You reveal that the relationship must meet a minimum standard to continue. This is devastating to a narcissist because it removes the illusion that they are the one in control. A boundary is not just a line, it is evidence that their narrative is no longer the only one you believe. A narcissist cannot tolerate someone who sees through the mask because their entire identity depends on that mask being believed. They spend their lives constructing an image, confident, admirable, impressive, morally superior, or endlessly victimized, and they rely on others accepting this version without question. The mask isn't decoration, it's armor. It protects them from confronting the insecurities, failures, and emotional emptiness they hide underneath. When someone finally sees the patterns, the contradictions, the manipulation, and the emotional performances for what they truly are, the narcissist feels exposed. Exposure to them is psychological death. Seeing through the mask removes the illusion of mystery they use to maintain power. Narcissists rely on being unpredictable, complex, or misunderstood to keep people chasing their approval. The moment you understand their behavior as repetitive and strategic rather than deep or meaningful, you stop responding in the emotional ways they expect. You no longer feel guilty when they sulk, impressed when they brag, or intimidated when they rage. Your clarity disrupts the emotional leverage they've counted on. They realize they cannot hook you anymore, and that realization is intolerable to them. When you see behind the mask, you also stop taking their manipulation personally. You recognize that their criticism is projection, their blame shifting is avoidance, and their emotional withdrawal is punishment, not coincidence. This loss of personal impact is devastating to a narcissist because their sense of control relies on your emotional sensitivity to their behavior. They need your confusion, your guilt, your doubt, and your desire to fix things. When your clarity cuts those strings, their tactics stop working. Without your emotional reactions, they feel powerless, and narcissists have no tolerance for powerlessness. Your ability to see through them also threatens their external image. Narcissists care deeply about how they appear to others. They manage impressions with precision. Charming in public, cruel in private, inspiring to outsiders, dismissive toward those close to them. When you understand the duality, you become a loose end. You carry information that contradicts their self-created myth. Even if you never expose them, the possibility that you could is enough to make them feel unsafe. They often react with anger, smear campaigns, or sudden coldness because they are trying to regain control of the narrative before you can disrupt it. But the deepest reason they cannot handle someone who sees through the mask is that it forces them into psychological territory they avoid at all costs: authenticity. Narcissists do not know who they are without the mask. Their identity is a shifting collage of borrowed traits, exaggerated achievements, and falsified feelings. When someone recognizes the performance, it threatens the fragile self that lies underneath, a self built on insecurity, shame, and emotional emptiness. Being seen clearly means being seen vulnerably, and vulnerability is something they experience as humiliation. Your clarity becomes a mirror they cannot bear to look into. It reflects the truth they work endlessly to outrun. They are not superior, not invincible, not special in the way they pretend. And because their entire life is structured around avoiding that truth, anyone who sees it becomes an immediate threat. A narcissist cannot handle your emotional independence because it severs the final thread of control they rely on, the thread that keeps you emotionally tied to their reactions, their approval, and their shifting moods. Emotional independence means you are no longer regulated by their praise, hurt by their silence, destabilized by their anger, or influenced by their guilt. To them, this is more threatening than confrontation, boundaries, or even physical distance. As long as you were emotionally reactive, they could predict you, control you, manipulate you. But the moment you develop emotional neutrality toward their behavior, they lose every psychological advantage they once had. Emotional independence starts with internal clarity. When you begin trusting your intuition, validating your own feelings, and making decisions without seeking their approval, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic. You stop asking yourself, what will they think or how will they react? And instead focus on what you think and what you need. This destroys the emotional ecosystem that narcissists depend on because they need you to be attuned to them, not to yourself. They need your self-worth to be externally anchored so they can push and pull at it. When it becomes internally anchored, their influence evaporates. A narcissist experiences your emotional independence as abandonment, disrespect, or betrayal, not because it actually is any of those things, but because it removes their access to your emotional state. They can't stand that their criticism no longer hurts you the way it used to, or that their approval doesn't thrill you anymore. Their pleasantness no longer seduces you, and their coldness no longer scares you. Every tactic they depend on becomes ineffective. They can't destabilize someone who has learned to regulate their own emotions. They can't intimidate someone who no longer absorbs their negativity. They can't guilt trip someone who no longer feels responsible for their emotional turbulence. To a narcissist, emotional independence feels like you've stepped outside the script they wrote for you. They expect you to respond predictably, cry when they withdraw, apologize when they accuse, chase when they distance, shrink when they criticize. When those reactions stop, they lose their ability to provoke, influence, or shape your emotional world. This is deeply unsettling for them because control is not an optional preference. It is their emotional oxygen. Your self-regulation suffocates the dynamic they're used to thriving in. Furthermore, emotional independence reveals the truth about the relationship. You never needed them as much as they needed your reactions. This reversal is intolerable for a narcissist. They may escalate their behavior when they sense this shift, becoming more dramatic, more accusatory, or more affectionate, depending on what they think might pull you back into their emotional orbit. But when you remain steady, their tactics lose their power. They realize that the version of you who once fed their ego, absorbed their chaos, and accepted their narrative no longer exists. Ultimately, emotional independence is more than detachment, it's transformation. It signals that you have reclaimed your emotional life from someone who depended on your vulnerability to maintain their illusion of dominance. And for the narcissist, that transformation is the ultimate threat. Not because you walked away, but because you finally learned to live without them. In the end, the moment you understand a narcissist is the moment their power ends. Not because you fought harder, not because you argued better, but because clarity makes control impossible. When you see the patterns, when you reclaim your emotional independence, when you stop feeding the ego they depend on, the entire illusion collapses. They can't manipulate someone who isn't confused. They can't dominate someone who has boundaries. They can't fool someone who sees behind the mask. And they cannot control someone who finally recognizes that their strength was borrowed from you. This is the truth they can't handle. Not your anger, not your silence, your awareness. Because once you learn who they really are, you stop playing the role they assigned you. And when you stop playing, the game ends completely.